When you think of the most famous mobsters in American history, you might think of names like John Dillinger or Al Capone, and think of mob cities like New York and Chicago and Las Vegas. But the Quad Cities along a turn in the Mississippi River along the Illinois-Iowa border probably don't come first to mind. And yet in many ways, John Looney, the Quad Cities vice lord, was the prototype for an American mob boss. And at one time he ruled over a vast empire of bootlegging, brothels, and protection rackets. Various types of organized crime started appearing in the United States, primarily among immigrant communities, at the end of the 19th century. But the rise of organized crime in the U.S. was largely associated with the prohibition of alcohol, with the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919. While it was originally assumed that prohibition of alcohol would reduce crime, attempts to enforce prohibition resulted in the rise of criminal gangs, who became more sophisticated and more violent as they combated federal agents and other criminal organizations to control the lucrative bootlegging of illegal alcohol. This would give rise to vast organizations, eventually spanning the nation, and powerful crime bosses who would control and sometimes fight over territory. Because of the relationship between alcohol and other vice, these gangs would often control other criminal activities like gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets. And to protect those networks, they would often subvert police and elected officials. Perhaps the most famous of the Prohibition-era bosses was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, who controlled a major crime organization in Chicago. Because of his many donations to charity and his flamboyant personality, Capone was seen more as a national celebrity than a criminal, at least until the public's mind was turned by the violence of his activities. But Capone, who took over mobster Johnny Torrio's organization in 1925, was by no means the first mob boss of his kind. Well-known, connected, controlling vice over vast swaths of territory, using violence and yet still keeping the public's attention. Now, if there was a prototype for the Prohibition-era mob boss, it was arguably a man whose territory was some 160 miles from Capone's Chicago. The area today known as the Quad Cities was originally populated by an Algonquin-speaking tribe called the Sauk. Sauk tribal leader Black Hawk, who led the Sauk in a conflict over land in 1832 that was called the Black Hawk War, was born there. After Black Hawk was defeated and the land ceded, communities grew along the riverbanks at the Illinois-Iowa border, where a short bend has the Mississippi River running east to west. The area was an important point for riverboat trade, and so grew in the area of industrialization. In 1848, John Deere, who had invented the first commercially successful steel plow, moved his manufacturing business there. In 1856, the first railroad bridge across the Mississippi River was built there, and a lawsuit concerning that bridge went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and built the reputation of a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. By the turn of the 20th century, the cities of Rock Island and Moline in Illinois and Davenport across the river in Iowa were calling themselves the Tri-Cities and had a combined population over 120,000. And the city of East Moline was growing enough that the name would soon change to the Quad Cities. Patrick John Looney, known as Patty John to his friends, was born in the small town of Ottawa, Illinois, in between the Quad Cities and Chicago, in 1865 to Irish immigrant parents. He started working at a young age, as was common at the time, and worked as a railroad telegrapher. That job moved him to the town of Rock Island. There he became interested in the law and studied for the bar, passing the exam at the age of 23. By most accounts, he was not very successful in the courtroom, but practicing law did put him in contact with the criminal element of the Quad Cities, many of whom would end up owing him as they could not afford their legal fees. Looney first ran afoul of the law in 1897, when he and his law partner were implicated in a scheme to defraud the city in the building of a storm drain, selling, it was claimed, inferior materials. While there were eventually convictions in the case, they were overturned on appeal. The case was important in that it taught Looney that there was money to be made in graft, and the connections that he made in the deal offered him an opportunity to get into the field where a criminal could really thrive in Illinois: politics. Looney became a leading figure in the local Democratic Party, using machine party tactics that eventually put him at odds with the local Democratic newspaper, the Argus, a rivalry that would last throughout his career. When he ran for State House of Representatives and lost, he blamed the editorials that had been written in the Argus. He acquired a printing press, and in 1895 started his own paper, the Rock Island News, billed as the only truthful paper in Rock Island. It turned out that journalism provided as much opportunity for vice as politics. The newspaper was a scandal sheet that he used to attack his enemies and to blackmail people. Authorities were cowed as his paper could destroy their career with a lie. Even as he carried on the war of words with the Argus, his paper allowed him to found his criminal empire, operating both a brothel and illegal gambling out of the same building where the paper was printed. And of course, customers of those businesses were also then vulnerable to blackmail. Between his connections and his blackmail and extortion, he was able to avoid convictions for the many libel suits brought against him. But the game went sour in 1912 when Looney took on the powerful mayor of Rock Island, Harry Shriver. Apparently Shriver had refused to intervene in a trial of one of Looney's henchmen, and so Looney went after Shriver in the news, accusing him of all sorts of misconduct and affairs. In response, Shriver had the paper shut down, had Looney arrested, and once arrested, Mayor Shriver himself beat Looney so badly that he had to be hospitalized. In response, Looney supporters agitated a riot in the streets that eventually included as many as 3,000 or 4,000 people. Significant damage was done to City Hall, and police returned fire, killing 2 people. The governor declared martial law and sent 600 National Guard troops to restore order. Looney left the area, although his lieutenants stayed around, but returned in 1921. Prohibition offered new opportunities, and his empire grew. He ran bootlegging in brothels, illegal saloons, his protection rackets, and an auto theft ring. He revived the news and its dirty tricks. Reportedly, Looney had as many as 300 prostitutes in his employ, all under his madam, Helen Van Dale, who was called the Queen of the Quad Cities. Van Dale carried on an affair with the chief of police and essentially ran the department. One of the favorite tactics was to have one of Van Dale's prostitutes leap into the arms of a local politician while one of Looney's newspapermen took a picture, and then the politician would be subject to blackmail for fear the picture would show up in the newspaper. Ironically, with so much money to be had, Mayor Shriver became a co-conspirator, and Looney controlled both the police and powerful politicians. At one point, he had as many as 150 gambling dens and brothels under his control. That was larger than Johnny Torrio's Chicago operation. So many local citizens patronized his illegal establishments that they essentially became immune to prosecution because to do so would implicate the entire town. But cracks started to form in his organization. A former henchman, fired over a fight with Looney's son Connor over a girl, gave evidence to federal agents. Then a saloon owner named Bill Gable, angry that Looney had increased his protection fee, handed over checks to revenue agents signed by Looney. When Gable was gunned down in the street, the Rock Island police, in Looney's pocket, blamed outside gunmen. But the rival paper, the Argus, refused to let the matter slide and kept asking, who killed Bill Gable? But Looney still managed to avoid prosecution. Then, on October 6, 1922, another disgruntled saloon owner named Anthony Bilberg and several other men attempted to kill Looney. Looney was not hit, but his 21-year-old son Connor was killed, shot multiple times, as well as a bystander. Despite being represented by the famous attorney Clarence Darrow, Bilberg and 3 of his associates were convicted in the murder of Connor Looney. Bilberg's granddaughter still claimed to own the gun that he used to commit the crime. But the violence was Looney's final undoing. Feds raided his businesses. He was indicted for transporting stolen property as part of his car theft ring. And then, in answer to the Argus's question, he was indicted for the murder of Bill Gable. Mayor Shriver and Police Chief Cox were also indicted on conspiracy charges. Looney managed to escape arrest for a while by hiding out with his relatives in Ottawa, but he was eventually captured in New Mexico. He was convicted in 1925 and sentenced to 14 years. He served 8.5 before being released for health reasons, but never returned to Rock Island. Patrick John Looney died of tuberculosis in 1947. And while he was not as famous as many other mob bosses of his era, he's still a legend in the Quad Cities, where you can get tours of his hideouts and haunts. Looney was the inspiration for a character in a 1998 graphic novel called The Road to Perdition, which was turned into a film in 2002. The name was changed to Rooney, and he was played by actor Paul Newman, but that character is entirely fictional, as the events all take place in the 1930s, long after Looney's organization had collapsed and he was sent to prison. Looney's violent rise and fall was emblematic of the era of the gangster in America. While the nation and Hollywood has somewhat romanticized the era, it was in fact violent, expletive, and often quite gruesome. Organized crime would become even more violent over the period of Prohibition and the Depression, and many mob bosses would rise who would become much more famous than John Looney. But in many ways, Looney was the prototype for a Prohibition-era mob boss. His organization was larger than Papa Johnny Torrio's organization in Chicago, with whom he had some criminal connections. And his rise and fall came even before Scarface Al Capone took over Torrio's organization and became a mob boss himself. If for no other reason than he was the model for an era, the infamous Quad Cities Vice Lord deserves to be remembered. Today is December 5th, and December 5th is a day of commemoration and for some celebration in America because on this date, 85 years ago today, the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and putting an end to the era in American history called Prohibition. Prohibition didn't actually end right away. The change wasn't effective until December 15th, and states could still prohibit the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol. But still, December 5th is a special day called Repeal Day that some Americans celebrate appropriately by hosting a cocktail party. And Repeal Day offers a great opportunity to talk about that era in American history where the illegal sale of alcohol fueled criminal enterprises and corrupted our politics. And at one time, bootleggers became both famous and infamous. And perhaps no tale of the bootleggers is more sordid than the story of a gang war that erupted in an already troubled southern Illinois, a gang war of which the Senate Special Committee to investigate crime and interstate commerce in 1950 said reached a peak in bloodiness unparalleled in United States crime history. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The southern third of Illinois is sometimes called Little Egypt, a name possibly derived because the borders of the southern part of the state are derived from major rivers somewhat like the Nile Delta. With the exception of the St. Louis suburbs on the east, it is largely a rural area of farmland and coal mines. It's not what you might think of as a place where violence would be common and far south of the notorious gangland of Chicago. But Little Egypt has a sordid past. A family feud in Williamson County in the 19th century called the Bloody Vendetta resulted in at least 8 murders. And labor unrest at coal mines led to bloody conflicts that were both labor and racially charged, as mine companies often used black workers as strikebreakers. Notably the 1922 Heron Massacre in the town of Heron in Williamson County, where 20 strikebreakers, company men, and mine guards were brutally murdered. The town was known as Bloody Heron for years after. The Shelton brothers grew up in Wayne County, a couple of counties over from Williamson County. In all, Ben and Agnes Shelton, who had migrated to Illinois from Kentucky after the Civil War, had 10 children, although 3 died in childhood. The Sheltons could be trouble. 2 of the brothers, Earl and Carl, were jailed in 1915 over a plot to rob a friend, where Earl had, apparently, borrowed the $5 used to buy the gun to commit the robbery from the friend who they then robbed. With the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, 3 of the brothers, Carl, Big Earl, and Bernie, who was also called Red, who had worked a number of jobs including driving a cab and coal mining, found opportunity. They operated a tavern in East St. Louis and had a knack for successfully bringing liquor or bootlegging up from the south for the illegal saloons and speakeasies of the St. Louis area. Their success was partly due to their connections throughout southern Illinois, but they were a good team, with smooth-talking Carl as the front man and short-tempered Bernie as the enforcer. Their liquor sales provided them with enough money to bribe public officials, eventually controlling much of the crime in Little Egypt, with virtual impunity from the law. In addition to bootlegging, they had their hands in gambling and prostitution and crimes such as auto theft and, at least allegedly, bank robbery. Their connections through southern Illinois brought them in contact with another man taking advantage of the opportunities offered by Prohibition, Charles Birger. Born in Russia in 1881, Birger's family had immigrated to the St. Louis area before the turn of the century. He had been a newspaper boy for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and his cart is still preserved at the Franklin County Historic Jail Museum in Benton, Illinois. Birger had served in the Army and the cavalry, and possibly been a bronc buster in South Dakota before returning to Illinois. He had gotten into bootlegging running an establishment in Ledford, Illinois, in Saline County, that provided refreshment, entertainment, and comfort to miners in the area. Despite being a bootlegger and running a brothel and gambling parlor, he was well liked in the area. He lived in nearby Harrisburg, where he was known to be generous and gregarious. He threw coins to children and donated to local charities, especially the police. Once, while jailed on an auto theft charge, he managed to procure 2 small donkeys somehow while in jail, and gave them to the police chief's 2 sons. Although often on the wrong side of the law, he was well liked in the area. But he did have a dangerous streak, although he managed to avoid charges for at least 2 killings as being justified by self-defense. Charlie Birger was famously quoted as saying, "I've killed many men, but never a good one." The former was certainly true, the latter a matter of opinion. It's not really clear how the Sheltons and Birger first met, but it could have been violent. They were both competing for the same space, the control of gambling and bootlegging in Little Egypt. But at first the gangs cooperated, and then they found a common enemy. The Ku Klux Klan had been founded by former officers of the Confederate Army in 1865 or 66, with the goal of restoring white supremacy in the Reconstruction-era South. But their tactics of violence and terror, usually conducted in robes and hoods that hid the perpetrator's identity, had caused a backlash and was suppressed by law enforcement. The Klan, however, got a new lease on life during Prohibition. The new Klan, which was refounded in 1915, was largely based on the rather dramatic portrayal of the Klan in the wildly popular 1915 film, The Birth of the Nation. The Klan found new popularity as a voice of law and order in the enforcement of Prohibition. This was not really a new Klan. Their consideration for Prohibition was really a way of carrying on their hatred against blacks, immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. But their Prohibition stance did place them as allies of progressives, Protestants, and federal lawmen. Klan membership soared during the 1920s into the millions. Little Egypt was fertile ground for the new KKK. Bootlegging was largely associated with immigrants who were already viewed with distaste by a largely Southern and Protestant population. Much of local government and law enforcement was in the pocket of the Shelton or Birger gangs, and there was a segment of the population that clamored for law and order and an end to the speakeasies, gambling dens, and brothels. The Klan brought in an agent, a former soldier and Prohibition officer named Glenn Young, to clean up the area. Young's authority was not clear, although he did often operate under court-issued warrants. He and his posse raided both speakeasies and homes of Italian and German immigrants who very often made homemade wine or beer. This put Young and the Klan at odds with the Birger and Shelton gangs, attacking both their businesses and their customers. The Shelton and Birger gangs started recruiting muscle and procuring arms to combat Young. This began a bloody conflict between mobsters and the Klan called the Klan Wars. Violent confrontations followed one after another, often requiring the involvement of the state militia to restore order. Criminal indictments for violence were common, but rarely pursued, as partisan juries could not bring convictions. Young survived an attempt on his life, probably by the Sheltons, that left his wife blinded from a shotgun blast, only to die in a shootout with a Shelton-aligned county deputy in Heron in 1925. But the Klan became a victim of their own tactics, with their supporters repulsed by the violence and heavy-handed tactics of men like Glenn Young. The nation became disillusioned with Prohibition, which had brought violence rather than peace. By 1930, Klan membership had dropped from a height of as much as 5 million in 1925 to just 30,000. On primary election day, April 13, 1926, a pro-Klan poll watcher in Heron tried to challenge some Catholic voters. The argument turned into a brawl, and the brawl turned into a gunfight in which 6 people were killed, and the militia again had to be called to restore order. No indictments were issued, no witnesses would come forward. It was the last gasp of the Klan Wars in southern Illinois. The nation was turning against Prohibition, and the Klan had lost its appeal. But that did not bring peace to Little Egypt. The Shelton and Birger gangs were now competing for space in the resulting power vacuum. It's not clear exactly what caused them to split. Some say it was an argument over splitting gambling receipts. Others say it was because some Shelton-aligned men robbed a friend of Birger's. But both gangs had become large and heavily armed as a result of the Klan Wars, and that force was turned against each other. Tit-for-tat shootings, murders, and bombings became common. The gang war had bizarre escalations. The Sheltons converted an old gas truck into a sort of armored car that they called the Tank. Birger responded by armoring a vehicle of his own. As Birger's Williamson County headquarters, a speakeasy called the Shady Rest, was well defended, the Sheltons escalated by using a mix of bribery and coercion to get a traveling barnstormer to take up a gang member in his Curtis Jenny airplane and throw bombs at the hideout. The makeshift bombs missed, although one version of the story says that a bulldog was killed. The joke was on the pilot. In exchange for flying the plane, the Sheltons had given him a car. It was stolen, and the hapless barnstormer spent a year in prison for auto theft. Some claimed this to be the first aerial bombing in U.S. history. The Birger gang hatched a plot to kill Big Earl Shelton while he was in the hospital with a fever. The assassins wore dresses, thinking it would be easier for ladies to sneak into the hospital, but they missed their chance. There were so many threats on Charlie Birger that he took to wearing an armored vest. The people could not count on the police to provide law and order. The police and local authorities were either cowed or in the pockets of the gangs, and the governor was not interested in sending in the militia yet again. Birger seemed to gain the upper hand when, through his own testimony and that of some of his associates, he managed to get the Shelton brothers convicted in federal court of an unsolved 1925 mail carrier robbery and sentenced to 25 years in prison. For a while, Birger had a free hand in southern Illinois, but the tables turned when one of the associates turned on him, recanting his testimony and implicating Birger in the murder of the Shelton-allied mayor of West City, Illinois. The Sheltons were released, and Birger was arrested. Charlie Birger had managed to escape legal jeopardy before with only light sentences, but not this time. He was tried in Franklin County, one he didn't control, and was convicted and sentenced to death. While the official means of execution in Illinois at the time of his sentencing was the electric chair, Birger was sentenced to be executed with the method in use at the time that the crime was committed. The sentence was that Birger would be hanged by the neck until dead, dead, dead. The sentence was carried out April 19th, 1928. His last words were, reportedly, "It's a beautiful day." People still disagree whether those were words of defiance or of regret. Some claim that his was the last public hanging in Illinois. 500 people witnessed the execution. A ticket was required. For a while, the Shelton brothers owned organized crime in East St. Louis and Little Egypt, but after Prohibition was repealed, they didn't have as many ready funds with which to bribe local officials. When they became involved in union politics and implicated in the murder of a union leader, law enforcement finally threw them out of East St. Louis. While St. Louis crime organizations took over the rackets in the East St. Louis area, the Sheltons remained in control of gambling and prostitution through much of Little Egypt, eventually dominating lucrative enterprises in the Peoria area. On October 23, 1948, Carl Shelton was driving in a war-surplus Jeep near his farm in Wayne County, Illinois, when he was ambushed and met by a hail of bullets. His body was riddled with 25 bullet holes. The assassins were never identified. His brother Bernie took over the business, leading the gambling in Peoria, but after a couple of assassination attempts, he was killed in July of 1949, shot with a high-powered rifle, and once again the assassin was never identified. Some people claim that it was a former gang member of theirs named Buster Wharton who had become a gang leader in St. Louis who had ordered the assassinations. Others claim that it was a local man named Charlie Harris who had a beef with the Sheltons. Their oldest brother, Roy, who had largely stayed out of the family gang business, was murdered in May of 1950, shot while driving his tractor on his farm. The last of the Shelton brother gang leaders, Big Earl Shelton, was shot twice in assassination attempts, but survived both attempts and moved the family to Florida. He died there of natural causes in 1986 at the age of 96. Charlie Birger and the Shelton brothers have an interesting legacy in southern Illinois where their exploits are passed on as family stories. Like many bootleggers at the time, some view them romantically as essentially heroes, Robin Hoods who were just serving a public need, and others remember them as the ones who protected them from the prejudices and depredations of the Ku Klux Klan. But like other bootleggers of the era, they were also cold-blooded, brutal killers. There were so many shootings and murders in Williamson County in the era that it became known as Bloody Williamson. More than 40 people were killed in the gang wars in Little Egypt in the 1920s. In Jazz Age America, speakeasies and an illicit market thrived even as the nation banned alcohol. By the end of Prohibition, gangster Al Capone became almost synonymous with bootlegging, as violating the law to supply the thirsty masses. But before the rise and fall of Capone, another child of immigrants from Chicago had established a nationwide bootlegging network and evaded the law. The exploits of George Remus, the king of the bootleggers, are history that deserve to be remembered. Chicago criminal defense lawyer George Remus found himself representing small-time bootleggers as Prohibition began in 1920s America. To better assist those clients, he read the Volstead Act, the law implementing Prohibition. The Volstead Act spelled out which alcoholic beverages were banned from sale. Looking over the new legislation with a lawyer's eye, Remus noted a loophole. The medicinal use of whiskey was excluded from the act. There were other exceptions that had to be negotiated, such as the religious use of wine, but the medicinal whiskey loophole intrigued the former pharmacist. Born in 1874 and coming to America as a child, he had a successful career in Chicago. At first he had worked as a pharmacist, getting his license at 19 and buying the pharmacy from his uncle at 21. He attended DePaul University College of Law, became an attorney in 1904, specialized in criminal defense, and became quite famous. He used his pharmacy background to get a client off on a murder charge. The client had been accused of poisoning the victim, and in a dramatic trial moment, Remus drank a vial of the alleged poison to demonstrate that it was not fatal. He didn't mention that he had swallowed the antidote right before. Remus noticed that his bootlegging clients were getting quite rich off of their operation of producing and distributing illegal beverages. Instead of letting them be the only ones to profit, he decided to turn to a life of crime and use his knowledge of the law to avoid prosecution. Remus divorced his wife of over 20 years in Chicago and relocated with his girlfriend, Imogene Holmes, to Cincinnati, Ohio, where nearly all of America's whiskey distilleries were within a 300-mile radius. From this strategic position, he began buying up the distilleries to implement his plan to exploit the loophole of the Volstead Act. He married his girlfriend in Newport, Kentucky in June 1920 and, crucially, put his new Ohio home in her name. Imogene's daughter, Ruth, lived with them, but he left his own daughter, Romola, behind in Chicago. Part of his plan to exploit the medicinal loophole was to buy up pharmacies as well as distilleries so they could sell bonded liquor under government licenses. His employees would then hijack his liquor from storage so they could sell it illegally. He even started a trucking company so his network could have a national reach. In Cincinnati alone, he employed over 3,000 people. Many had lost jobs with Prohibition and viewed it as an unfair law. Remus became a folk hero of sorts because Prohibition was unpopular and he was seen as providing the supply for the high demand for alcohol. He once said, "Anyone who is in possession of an ounce of whiskey is a bootlegger." With the help of his trusted subordinates, he made $40 million in 3 years. They entertained many guests in their lavish mansion, and they were known as great, maybe even profligate hosts. For New Year's Eve, 1922, they had a party that boasted some of the finest families in town. As gifts, Remus and Imogene gave to all the men diamond stick pins, and to their wives, they gave automobiles. Throughout the early 1920s, Remus became known as the king of the bootleggers, with the assistance of corrupt government officials whom he had bought off. He paid Prohibition agents to not raid his operations and bought extra government licenses to sell medicinal liquor. Even the United States Department of Justice was not immune from his corruption. However, Remus was not able to evade justice forever. Federal agents who were not paid off discovered his operations and he was caught. In 1925, he was indicted for thousands of Volstead Act violations. Pending criminal charges did not prevent Remus from continuing to engage in bootlegging. His network tipped him off to an opportunity in St. Louis, and he took a trip while under indictment to the Mississippi River town. The Jack Daniels distillery was ripe for siphoning off whiskey and moving it in a fashion that he had used in Cincinnati. He agreed to participate in the scheme, staying at the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. Federal agents were on his trail, so he tried to be discreet. But his partners in the St. Louis adventure were not as careful as he was. Instead of waiting to siphon off whiskey gradually and move it under the noses of Prohibition agents, they moved it all at once. Quickly caught, and Remus lost money on the scheme. He went to trial, and his friend in the Attorney General's office, Jess Smith, promised him he would not be convicted. Smith had accepted Remus's bribes, but however, the jury convicted him. Smith then promised that his conviction would not be upheld on appeal. It was. Smith promised a presidential pardon or a Supreme Court victory if Remus paid him more money. Remus realized he was being played and quit paying, accepting his fate as a federal prisoner. Smith later committed suicide when his corrupt activities were discovered. Some, however, believed he was murdered for what he knew about the extent of official corruption surrounding Prohibition. The person whose job it was to enforce the Volstead Act was Mabel Willebrandt, an attorney from Los Angeles who had begun her career defending prostitutes. She joined the Justice Department as an assistant attorney general. During Prohibition, she was head of the unit in charge of prosecuting bootleggers. Her job was made more difficult by corrupt agents and elite defiance of the law. In need of money, Remus pled with Imogene to sign over the house to him, but she refused. Remus had made millions of dollars from his bootlegging schemes, but he could not get the wealth from his house. He was sent to prison in Atlanta, and while there, he met and befriended Franklin Dodge. Dodge was actually a federal agent in prison undercover trying to bust a bootlegging ring. Remus, though, confided in him that Imogene had control over his vast estate. Armed with this information, Dodge sought out Imogene after resigning his job. Responding to his affections, Imogene started a relationship with him while Remus was in prison. Dodge and Imogene sold off Remus's distilleries and his property, pocketing the money for themselves. Remus, meanwhile, turned into a witness for the state and testified against other bootleggers, providing key evidence in an Indianapolis case. While there, a hitman tried to make an attempt on his life, but failed, partially because a reporter from St. Louis had tipped off police after overhearing it. Imogene and Dodge were rumored to be behind the attempt. Imogene and Dodge also attempted to have Remus deported, reporting to authorities that he did not have naturalization paperwork. His parents were Germans who immigrated to the United States. Remus was able to defeat the deportation attempt. In 1927, with Remus still in prison, Imogene filed for divorce and refused to give him any of his own money. Remus was released from prison only to face his divorce case. He remained haunted by Imogene and Dodge running off with his money. He chased them across the country, but they were always a step ahead of him, and he could not find out what they did with his estate. Not sleeping and overcome with thoughts of his wife cheating on him with another man, Remus shot her on the way to court for a hearing. He had his driver chase the car she was in and drive it off the road. He jumped out and shot her in the abdomen while onlookers watched. Imogene was taken to the hospital, but succumbed to her injuries. Remus was arrested for murder. The prosecutor was Charles Taft II, son of Supreme Court Justice and former President William Howard Taft. Remus decided to represent himself. Remembering an old case in Chicago, Remus pled not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. He brought in Clarence Darrow, an old friend from his Chicago days, to testify about his character. Others testified to his state of mind in the days before the murder. The jury debated only 19 minutes and acquitted him. After winning, he took photos with the jury. The judge and reporters covering the trial were disgusted with the jury's behavior. One reporter likened it to the ending of the new play Chicago, where the murderesses, having been acquitted of their murder charges, became celebrities. The Cincinnati Post said, "The Chicago bootlegger gets a Chicago verdict." Prosecutors then attempted to have him committed to an insane asylum. However, they were prevented from doing so because of their previous claim that he was not insane. Remus moved across the Ohio River to Covington, Kentucky. He remarried, this time to his longtime secretary, Blanche Watson. He ran a small consulting firm before having a stroke in 1950. He died in 1952 after 2 years of living under a nurse's care. He's buried in Falmouth, Kentucky. Many believe Remus's life was F. Scott Fitzgerald's inspiration for The Great Gatsby. It is rumored that they met while Fitzgerald was stationed in Kentucky, but that is doubtful. However, by the time Fitzgerald began to write The Great Gatsby, Remus was well known. The similarities are conspicuous. Both owned a chain of pharmacies, both threw lavish parties, both wanted elite acceptance, and both were in love with a woman who didn't necessarily return their affections. Willebrandt pioneered the idea of using tax law to prosecute bootleggers. Her theory was confirmed when successfully used against Al Capone. She left the Justice Department after believing that President Hoover would elevate her to Attorney General and being disappointed that she was denied that opportunity upon his election. She had campaigned for him, and candidate Al Smith nicknamed her Prohibition Portia. She had a successful career in the private sector, pioneering aviation law and radio law. She died in 1963 in California. Al Capone and his gang occupy a large portion of the American mythology regarding bootlegging. But before his gang of bootleggers and gangland enforcers, there was another Chicagoan who was supplying the people's thirst. Capone was once famously quoted as saying, "I'm like any other man. All I do is supply a demand." George Remus, the forgotten king of the bootleggers, would agree. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.